Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western Literary Canon out loud. Today we are continuing in Life with Father by Clarence Day. This chapter is entitled, Father is Firm with His Ailments. Father got annoyed at us when we didn't stay well. He usually stayed well himself, and he expected us to be like him, and not faint and slump on his hands, and thus add to his burdens. He was fearless about disease. He despised it. All this talk about germs, he said, was merely newfangled nonsense. He said that when he was a boy, there had been no germs that he knew of. Perhaps invisible insects existed, but what of it? He was as healthy as they were. "If any damned germs want to have a try at me," he said, "bring 'em on." From Father's point of view, Mother didn't know how to handle an ailment. He admired her most of the time and thought that there was nobody like her. He often said to his boys, "Your mother is a wonderful woman," but he always seemed to disapprove of her when she was ill. Mother went to bed, for instance, at such times, yet she didn't make noises. Father heard a little gasping moan sometimes, but she didn't want him to hear even that. Consequently, he was sure she wasn't suffering. There was nothing to indicate it, he said. The worse she felt, the less she said about it, and the harder it was for him to believe that there was anything really wrong with her. "He says he can't see why I stay in bed so long," she once wrote to me when I was away. "But this colitis is a mean affair which keeps one perfectly flat. The doctor told him yesterday the meaning of colitis, but he said he had never heard of the damn thing, thank God. He feels very abused that he should be so upset by people with queer things the matter with them and doctors all over the place." Mother underlined the word people. Even Mother's colds made him fretful. Whenever she had one, she kept going as long as she could, pottering about her room looking white and tired, with a shawl around her shoulders. But sometimes she had to give up and crawl into her bed. Father pished and pooed to himself about this and muttered that it was silly. He said Mother was perfectly healthy. When people thought that they were ill, he declared, it didn't mean that there was anything the matter with them. It was merely a sign of weak character. He often told Mother how weak it was to give in to an ailment, but every time he tried to strengthen her character in this respect, he said she seemed to resent it. He never remembered a try except when she could hardly hold her head up. From his point of view, though, that was the very time when she needed his help. He needed hers, too, or not exactly her help, but her company, and he never hesitated to say so. When she was ill, he felt lost. He usually came up from his office at about 5 or 6. The first thing he did was to look around the house to find Mother. It made his home feel queer and empty to him when she wasn't there. One night about 6 o'clock, he opened the door of her bedroom. There was no light except for a struggling little fire which flickered and sank in the grate. A smell of witch hazel was in the air, mixed with spirits of camphor. On the bed, huddled up under an afghan, Mother lay still in the dark. "Are you there, Vinny?" Father said in a voice even louder than usual because of his not being sure. Mother moaned, "Go away." "What?" he asked in astonishment. "Go away, oh, go away." "Damnation," he said, marching out. "Claire!" "What is it?" "Won't you please shut my door again?" Father ground his teeth and shut it with such a bang that it made Mother jump. He told himself she had nothing the matter with her. She'd be all right in the morning. He ate a good dinner. Being lonely, he added an extra glass of claret and some toasted crackers and cheese. He had such a long and dull evening that he smoked 2 extra cigars. After breakfast the next morning, he went to her bedroom again. The fire was out. 2 worn old slippers lay on a chair. The gray daylight was cheerless. Father stood at the foot of Mother's bed, looking disconsolately at her because she wasn't well yet. He had no one to laugh at or quarrel with. His features were lumpy and gloom. "What is it?" Mother asked in a whisper, opening her weary eyes. "Nothing," he he said loudly. "Nothing." "Well, for mercy's sake, don't come in here looking like that, Claire," Mother begged. "What do you mean? Looking like what?" "Oh, go away," Mother shrieked. "When people are sick, they like to see a smile or something. I never will get well if you stand there and stare at me that way. And shut my door quietly this time, and let me alone." Outside her door, when I asked him how Mother was, he said with a chuckle, "She's all right again. She isn't out of bed yet, but she sounds much better this morning." Father's own experiences in a sick room had been very few. When he was in his early 30s, he had an attack of gout which lasted 3 weeks. From that time until he was 74 and had pneumonia, he had no other serious illnesses. He said illnesses were mostly imaginary, and he didn't believe in them. He even declared that his pneumonia was imaginary. "It's only some idea of that doctor's," he said. "Nothing the matter with me but a cold." Our regular physician had died, and this new man and 2 trained nurses had all they could do at first to keep Father in bed. The new doctor had pale blue eyes, a slight build, and a way of inwardly smiling at the persons he talked to. He had a strong will in crises, and he was one of the ablest physicians in town. Mother had chosen him, however, chiefly because she liked one of his female cousins. When Father got worse, the doctor kept warning him that it really was pneumonia, and that if he wouldn't be tractable, he might not get over it, especially at 74. Father lay in bed glowering at him and said, "I didn't send for you, sir. You needn't stand there and tell me what you want me to do. I know all about doctors. They think they know a damned lot, but they don't. Give your pills and things to Mrs. Day. She believes in them. That's all I have to say. There's no need to continue this discussion. There's the door, sir. Goodbye." But somehow the discussion kept on, and much to his surprise, Father at last became convinced he was ill. The doctor, leaving him alone in his bedroom to digest the bad news, came out in the hall, anxious and tired, to have a few words with Mother. As they stood outside Father's door, whispering quietly, they heard his voice from within. Apparently, now that he knew he was in trouble, his thoughts had turned to his God. "Have mercy!" They heard him shouting indignantly. "I say have mercy, damn it!" Any sufferings that Father ever had, he attributed solely to God. Naturally, he never thought for a moment that God could mean him to suffer. He couldn't imagine God's wishing to punish him either, for his conscience was clear. His explanation seemed to be that God was clumsy, not to say muddle-headed. However, in spite of God and the doctor, Father got over pneumonia, just as some 40 years before he had got over his gout. Only in conquering his gout, he had had the help of a cane and a monsieur called Old Lowndes. While the gout was besieging him, Father sat in a big chair by the fire with his bad foot on a stool, armed with a cane which he kept constantly ready. Not that he used the cane to walk with. When he walked, he hopped around on his other foot, uttering strong howls of fury. But he valued his cane highly and needed it, too, as a war club. He threatened the whole family with it. When visitors entered the room, he brandished it fiercely at them to keep them away from his toe. Old Lowndes was allowed to approach nearer than others, but he was warned that if he made any mistakes, that cane would come down on his head. Father felt there was no knowing what harm Lowndes might have done if he hadn't shaken his cane at him and made him take care. As it was owing largely to this useful stick, Father got well. This experience convinced him that any disease could be conquered by firmness. When he had had a cold, his method of dealing with it was to try to clear it out by main force, either by violently blowing his nose, or, still better, by sneezing. Mother didn't like him to sneeze. He did it with such a roar. She said she could feel it half across the room, and she was sure it was catching. Father said this was nonsense. He said his sneezes were healthy, and presently we'd hear a hearty, triumphant blast as he sneezed again. Aside from colds, which he had very seldom, his only foes were sick headaches. He said headaches only came from eating, however. Hence a man who knew enough to stop eating could always get rid of one that way. It took time to starve it out thoroughly. It might take several hours. But as soon as it was gone, he could eat again and enjoy his cigar. When one of these headaches started, Father lay down and shut his eyes tightly and yelled. The severity of a headache could be judged by the volume of sound he put forth. His idea seemed to be to show the headache that he was just as strong as it was, and stronger. When a headache and he went to bed together, they were a noisy pair. Father's code required him to be game, I suppose. He never spoke or thought of having a code. He wasn't that sort of person, but he denounced men whose standards were low, as to gameness or anything else. It didn't occur to him to conceal his sufferings, however. When he had any pains, he expressed them as fully as he knew how. His way of being brave was not to keep still, but to keep on fighting the headache. Mother used to beg him to be quiet at night, even if he did have a headache, and not wake up the whole house. He never paid the slightest attention to such a request. When she said, "Please don't groan so much, Claire," he'd look at her in disgust, as though he were a warrior being asked to stifle his battle cries. One evening he found Mother worrying because Aunt Emma was ill with some disease that was then epidemic. "Oh, pooh," Father said. "Nothing the matter with Emma. You can trust people to get any ailment, whatever that's fashionable. They hear of a lot of other people having it, and the first thing you know they get scared and they think they have it themselves. Then they go to bed and send for the doctor. The doctor. All poppycock." "Well, but Claire, dear, if you were in charge of them, what would you do instead?" "Cheer 'em up. That's the way to cure 'em." How would you cheer them up, darling?" Mother asked doubtfully. I'd tell 'em, bah!" Father wakes up the village. One of the most disgraceful features of life in the country, Father often declared, was the general inefficiency and slackness of small village tradesmen. He said he had originally supposed that such men were interested in business, and that was why they had opened their shops and sunk capital in them. But no, they never used them for anything but gossip and sleep. They took no interest in civilized ways. Hadn't heard of them, probably. He said that, of course, if he were camping out on the Vent or the tundra, he would expect few conveniences in the neighborhood and would do his best to forego them. But why should he be confronted with the wilds 20 miles from New York? Usually when Father talked this way, he was thinking of ice. He strongly objected to spending even one day of his life without a glass of cold water beside his plate at every meal. There was never any difficulty about this in our home in the city. A great silver ice water pitcher stood on the sideboard all day, and when Father was home, its outer surface was frosted with cold. When he had gone to the office, the ice was allowed to melt sometimes, and the water got warmish, but never in the evenings or on Sundays when Father might want some. He said he liked water. He told us it was one of nature's best gifts, but he said that like all her gifts, it was unfit for human consumption unless served in a suitable manner. And the only right way to serve water was icy cold. It was still more important that each kind of wine should be served at whatever the right temperature was for it, and kept at it too. No civilized man would take dinner without wine, Father said, and no man who knew the first thing about it would keep his wine in hot cellars. Mother thought this was a mere whim of Father's. She said he was fussy. How about people who lived in apartments, she asked him, who didn't have cellars? Father replied that civilized persons didn't live in apartments. One of the first summers that Father ever spent in the country, he rented a furnished house in Irvington on the Hudson, not far from New York. It had a garden, a stable, and 1 or 2 acres of woods, and Father arranged to camp out there with many misgivings. He took a train for New York every morning at 8:10 after breakfast, and he got back between 5 and 6, bringing anything special we might need along with him, such as a basket of peaches from the city, or a fresh package of his own private coffee. Things went well until one day in August the Iceman didn't come. It was hot, he and his horses were tired, and he hated to come to us anyhow because the house we had rented was perched up on top of a hill. He said afterward that on this particular day he had not liked the idea of making his horse drag that big ice wagon up that sharp and steep road to sell us 50 cents worth of ice. Besides, all his ice was gone anyhow. The heat had melted it on him. He had 4 or 5 other good reasons, so he didn't come. Father was in town. The rest of us waited in astonishment, wondering what could be the matter. We were so used to the regularity and punctilio of life in the city that it seemed unbelievable to us that the Iceman would fail to appear. We discussed it at lunch. Mother said that the minute he arrived, she would have to give him a talking to. After lunch had been over an hour, and he still hadn't come, she got so worried about what Father would say that she decided to send to the village. There was no telephone, of course. There were no motors. She would have liked to spare the horse if she could, for he had been worked hard that week. But as this was a crisis, she sent for Morgan, the coachman, and told him to bring up the dog cart. The big English dog cart arrived. 2 of us boys and the coachman drove off. The sun beat down on our heads. Where the heavy harness was rubbing on Brownie's coat, he broke out into a thick, whitish lather. Morgan was sullen. When we boys were along, he couldn't take off his stiff black high hat or unbutton his thick padded coat. Worse still, from his point of view, he couldn't stop at a bar for a drink. That was why Mother had sent us along with him, of course, and he knew it. We arrived at the little town after a while, and I went into the coal and ice office. A wiry-looking old clerk was dozing in a corner, his chair tilted back and his chin resting on his dingy shirt front. I woke this clerk up. I told him about the crisis at our house. He listened unwillingly, and when I had finished, he said it was a very hot day. I waited. He spat. He said he didn't see what he could do because the ice house was locked. I explained earnestly that this was the Day family and that something must be done right away. He hunted around his desk for a few minutes, found his chewing tobacco, and said, "Well, Sonny, I'll see what I can do about it." I thanked him very much, as that seemed to me to settle the matter. I went back to the dog cart. Brownie's check rein had been unhooked, and he stood with his head hanging down. He looked sloppy. I wouldn't have been so bad with a buggy, but a slumpy horse in a dog cart can look pretty awful. Also, Morgan was gone. He reappeared soon, coming out of a side door down the street, buttoning up his coat, but with his hat tilted back. He looked worse than the horse. We checked up the weary animal's head again and drove slowly home. A hot little breeze in our rear moved our dust along with us. At the foot of the hill, we boys got out to spare Brownie our extra weight. We unhooked his check rein again. He dragged the heavy cart up. Mother was sitting out on the piazza. I said the ice would come soon now. We waited. It was a long afternoon. At 5 o'clock, Brownie was hitched up again. The coachman and I drove back to the village. We had to meet Father's train. We also had to break the bad news to him that he would have no ice water for dinner, and that there didn't seem to be any way to chill his Rhine wine. The village was as sleepy as ever, but when Father arrived and learned what the situation was, he said it would have to wake up. He told me that he had had a long, trying day at the office. The city was hotter than the desert of Sahara, and he was completely worn out, but that if any Iceman imagined for a moment he could behave in that manner, he, Father, would take his damned head off. He strode into the coal and ice office. When he came out, he had the clerk with him, and the clerk had put on his hat and was vainly trying to calm Father down. He was promising that he himself would come with the ice wagon if the driver had left, and deliver all the ice we could use, and he'd be there inside an hour. Father said, "Inside of an hour be hanged. You'll have to come quicker than that." The clerk got rebellious. He pointed out that he'd have to go to the stables and hitch up the horses himself, and then get someone to help him hoist a block of ice out of the ice house. He said it was most time for his supper, and he wasn't used to such work. He was only doing it as a favor to Father. He was just being neighborly. Father said he'd have to be neighborly in a hurry because he wouldn't stand it, and he didn't know what the devil the ice company meant by such actions. The clerk said it wasn't his fault, was it? It was the driver's. This was poor tactics, of course, because it wound Father up again. He wasn't interested in whose fault it was, he said. It was everybody's. What he wanted was ice, and plenty of it, and he wanted it in time for his dinner. A small crowd, which had collected by this time, listened admiringly as Father shook his finger at the clerk and said he dined at 6:30. The clerk went loping off toward the stables to hitch up the big horses. Father waited till he had turned the corner. Followed by the crowd, Father marched to the butcher's. After nearly a quarter of an hour, the butcher and his assistant came out, unwillingly, carrying what seemed to be a coffin wrapped in a black mackintosh. It was a huge cake of ice. Father got in front, sat on the box seat beside me, and took up the reins. We drove off. The coachman was on the rear seat, sitting back to back with us, keeping the ice from sliding out with the calves of his legs. Father went a few doors up the street to a little house furnishing shop and got out again. I went in the shop with him this time. I didn't want to miss any further scenes of this performance. Father began proceedings by demanding to see all the man's ice boxes. There were only a few. Father neglected the largest he had. Then, when the sale seemed arranged, and when the proprietor was smiling broadly with pleasure at his sudden windfall, Father said he was buying that refrigerator only on 2 conditions. The first was that it had to be delivered at his home before dinner. Yes, now, right away. The shopkeeper explained over and over that this was impossible, but that he'd have it up the next morning. Father said no, he didn't want it the next morning, he'd have it at once. He added that he dined at 6:30 and that there was no time to waste. The shopkeeper gave in. The second condition, which was then put to him firmly, was staggering. Father announced that the ice box must be delivered to him full of ice. The man said he was not in the ice business. Father said, "Very well then, I don't want it." The man said obstinately that it was an excellent ice box. Father made a short speech. It was the one that we had heard so often at home, about the slackness of village tradesmen, and he put such strong emotion and scorn in it that his voice rang through the shop. He closed it by saying, "An icebox is of no use to a man without ice, and if you haven't the enterprise, the gumption to sell your damned goods to a customer who wants them delivered in conditions to use, you had better shut up your shop and be done with it. Not in the ice business, hey? You aren't in business at all." He strode out. The dealer came to the door just as Father was getting into the dog cart and called out anxiously, "All right, Mr. Day, I'll get that refrigerator filled for you and send it up right away." Father drove quickly home. A thunderstorm seemed to be brewing, and this had waked Brownie up, or else Father was putting some of his own supply of energy into him. The poor old boy probably needed it as again he climbed the steep hill. I got out at the foot, and I walked along behind. I saw that Morgan was looking kind of desperate, trying to sit in the corner position with his arms folded while he held an ice with his legs. The big cake was continually slipping and sliding around under the seat, doing its best to plunge out. It had bumped against his calves all the way home. They must have got good and cold. When the dog cart drew up at the door, Father remained seated a moment, while Morgan, the waitress, and I pulled and pushed at the ice. The mackintosh had come off it by this time. We dumped it out on the grass. A little later, after Morgan had unharnessed and hurriedly rubbed down the horse, he ran back to help us boys break the cake up, push the chunks around to the back door, and cram them into the icebox while Father was dressing for dinner. Mother had calmed down by this time, and the Rhine wine was cooling. "Don't get it too cold," Father called. Then the iceman arrived. The old clerk was with him like a warden in charge of a prisoner. Mother stepped out to meet them, and at once gave the iceman the scolding that had been waiting for him all day. The clerk asked how much ice we wanted. Mother said we didn't want any now. Mr. Day had brought home some, and we had no room for more in the icebox. The iceman looked at the clerk. The clerk tried to speak, but no words came. Father put his head out of the window. "Take £100, Vinny," he said. "There's another box coming." £100 block was brought into the house and heaved into the washtub. The waitress put the mackintosh over it. The ice wagon left. Just as we all sat down to dinner, the new icebox arrived, full. Mother was provoked. She said, "Really, Claire," crossly. "Now what am I to do with that piece that's waiting out in the washtub?" Father chuckled. She told him he didn't know the first thing about keeping house, and went out to the laundry with the waitress to tackle the problem. The thunderstorm broke and crashed. We boys ran around shutting the windows upstairs. Father's soul was at peace. He dined well, and he had his coffee and cognac served to him on the piazza. The storm was over by then. Father snuffed a deep breath of the sweet-smelling air and smoked his evening cigar. "Clarence," he said, "King Solomon had the right idea about these things. Whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, Solomon said, do thy damnedest." Mother called me inside. "Whose mackintosh is that?" she asked anxiously. "Katie's torn a hole in the back." I heard Father saying contentedly on the piazza, "I like plenty of ice." This is the end of Part 2 of Life with Father. Thank you for listening.